She hadn't even made it past the corner store before the weight of the past started pressing on her chest. Captain Nyla Warren walked through Monroe Ridge like a ghost in daylight scene, familiar, but not quite home. The sun hung low over the cracked Louisiana pavement, casting long, golden shadows that stretched like memories she wasn't ready to face. 7 years gone. 7 years since she buried her mother, boarded a plane, and didn't look back. War zones were simpler. At least there you knew who the enemy was. Now she was back, duffel bag slung over one shoulder, not in uniform, but wearing the unmistakable bearing of someone who had learned how to survive fire, both literal and the kind that burns inside. Civilian clothes couldn't hide what the military had carved into her posture. Chin steady, steps even, eyes always scanning. You don't spend a decade leading SEAL teams in Kandahar, Fallujah, and anywhere the maps forget, then come home expecting peace. Monroe Ridge hadn't changed. The same rusted barber pole spun lazily by the corner. The same kids ran drills on the basketball court like their lives depended on it. The air still smelled like hot asphalt, fried catfish, and someone's too loud radio. It was all the same. That was the problem. A group of teens loitered outside the corner store, laughter bubbling out like soda pop. One of them, maybe 16, looked up and did a double take. "You military?" he asked, not rudely, just curious. Nyla paused. She could have said yes, could have rattled off her rank and all the places she'd bled, but she just gave a small nod. "Something like that." He grinned. "Yeah, figured. My cousin's in the army, walks like you." Before she could reply, he was gone. Just a moment, passing, but it stuck with her. She hadn't come back for glory. She came back to walk her own street without being questioned, but that would prove harder than expected. The moment passed, but the echo of it lingered. Nyla kept walking, the soles of her sneakers whispering against sun-baked pavement. The streets wrapped around her like an old coat, still warm, still fitting, but full of worn seams and silent weight. The block hadn't changed much since she left. That in itself felt like a betrayal. The old fish shack, Miss Thelma's kitchen, still leaked the smell of grease and cayenne into the air. The faded sign above her father's former barbershop still read Cliff's Cuts in chipped red paint. Even the busted fire hydrant on Ashland and Fifth still sprayed mist on hot days, like some unspoken summer ritual no one dared to fix. These streets had frozen in time. She hadn't. A little girl on a pink scooter zoomed past, shouting something to a friend behind her. Nyla stepped aside without thinking. It was the kind of move she'd made 1,000 times overseas: quick sidestep, assess the angle, no threat. Just a kid, just home. But her muscles stayed tensed longer than they should have. She passed by a chain-link fence that bordered the basketball court, the clang of rubber against concrete ringing familiar. Boys sprinted down the length of the court like their next meal depended on the score. She used to watch from those same sidelines, back when her mother was still alive, back when she still had knees that didn't ache in the rain. She almost smiled, but the further she walked, the deeper the discomfort burrowed. This was supposed to be her street, her roots. But now she felt like a visitor, like someone occupying the shell of a life she left behind. The uniform might be packed in her bag, but the discipline, the edge, the war, it came with her, whether anyone could see it or not. A sudden bark startled her, a pit bull behind a gate, its tail wagging despite the growl. She flinched before realizing the dog wasn't coming for her. Another automatic reaction, hyper-awareness that didn't shut off, not even here, especially not here. She was trained to move through foreign lands like she belonged, but here where she'd grown up, scraped her knees, kissed her first boy. She felt like a stranger. Maybe it wasn't the place that had changed. Maybe it was her. The breeze shifted as Nyla turned onto Pine Street, a narrow stretch lined with leaning mailboxes and porches draped in half-hearted decorations from holidays long past. The street should have felt safe. She grew up 2 blocks from here, but instead, her pulse picked up. It was subtle at first, a faint hum, the slow crawl of tires on asphalt. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. A patrol car, moving far too slowly for a neighborhood where cops usually didn't even tap the brakes. She kept her stride even, her shoulders loose but upright. Civilian mode, but with an edge. The duffel bag on her shoulders suddenly felt heavier, like it carried more than clothes. Like it carried all the weight she'd fought to leave behind. The cruiser eased up beside her, window down. She kept her eyes forward. "Excuse me, ma'am." She stopped, turned. Officer Brent Maddox, white, mid-40s. The kind of cop who wore mirrored sunglasses like armor and smirked like he knew something you didn't. His forearm dangled casually out the window, but his voice held the subtle strain of a man searching for control. "Mind telling me what you're doing around here?" Nyla tilted her head slightly. She didn't answer right away. She wanted to see if he'd repeat himself. He did. "Just walking," she said, cool and calm. "Where to?" She lifted a brow. "Didn't realize I needed an itinerary." That smirk flickered, tightened. The window didn't shield the tension now building in his jaw. "We've had some break-ins around here lately," he offered, like that explained everything. Like that gave him license. Nyla didn't flinch. "You see me breaking into something?" A pause. He leaned back slightly, reassessing. "Just doing my job." She adjusted the strap on her duffel, steady. "So am I," she murmured, barely loud enough for him to hear. But he did, and it landed. There was something about her tone, about the way she didn't shrink, that rubbed him the wrong way. She knew it. She'd seen that look in other men, in other uniforms, in other countries. The uniform changed. The behavior rarely did. And now the patrol car was parked. The air shifted again, not with the breeze this time, but with something thicker, unspoken. Maddox stepped out of the car, and Nyla knew this wasn't about a break-in. Not really. Maddox closed the door of the patrol car with a muted thunk, his boots crunching over loose gravel as he approached. The quiet hum of the neighborhood faded behind the growing silence. Nyla didn't move, didn't step back. She simply stood, shoulders squared, chin level, eyes steady. "Let's see some ID," he said, tone flatter now, more official. But the undercurrent authority laced with suspicion was hard to miss. She didn't blink. "What for?" He offered a tight smile. "Routine check. Like I said, just doing my job." Nyla reached slowly, deliberately, into her side pocket. Her movements were smooth, unthreatening, intentional. She pulled out her military ID and held it up, not offering it, just letting him see. Her fingers never let go. Maddox squinted, then chuckled under his breath as he took a step closer. "Military, huh?" She gave a single nod. "Where exactly do you serve?" "I don't answer unnecessary questions." The smirk cracked wider. "That so?" And before she could react, he reached out and snatched the ID from her hand. It was fast, but not unexpected. Her jaw clenched slightly, but she said nothing. He turned the card over, inspecting it like a fake $20 bill, like something couldn't possibly be real. "Navy SEALs?" he read aloud, dragging out each syllable like a joke. "Well now, that's cute." A flicker of heat flared in Nyla's chest. Not rage, not yet. Just the familiar burn of being doubted, dismissed by men who believed uniform and gender were mutually exclusive. She'd heard worse, felt worse, but every time it struck the same nerve. "Return it," she said, voice calm but firm. Maddox didn't. Instead, he tilted his head like he was inspecting her from a different angle. "You expect me to believe someone like you made it through buds?" "You can run it," she said evenly. "You'll find out soon enough." But that wasn't what he wanted. He wasn't looking for truth. He was looking for control. From across the street, someone paused. Then another. Phones came out, not hidden, but obvious. And Maddox saw it too. His jaw shifted. His hand tightened around her ID. And still Nyla didn't move an inch. He was losing the upper hand. And he knew it. The street had gone still. Somewhere in the distance, a car stereo thumped faintly beneath the weight of silence. But here on this narrow stretch of Pine Street, everything had paused. Nyla could feel it. The shift. The tension. The crowd wasn't just curious anymore. They were watching. Phones steady, breaths held. Officer Maddox's hand lingered near his belt, just grazing the edge of his cuffs. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't procedural. It was a signal. "You're not cooperating," he said, voice taut. Nyla's eyes stayed locked on his. "With what? A baseless stop?" Maddox took a step closer, just enough to breach her space. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." "No." The word dropped like a stone. Gasps flickered through the onlookers. A woman with braids near the food truck whispered, "She's not playing." A young man across the street muttered, "You better chill." But Maddox didn't chill. His face flushed red beneath the shadow of his sunglasses. His pride was louder than the crowd now, and louder than logic. "You think you can refuse me?" he hissed. Nyla's voice remained level. I know my rights. You have no cause. His fingers twitched. Then he lunged. But she moved first. A pivot. A precise redirection. Her hand caught his wrist midair and shifted his momentum with effortless control. She didn't hit him, didn't need to. His body betrayed him, stumbling sideways as he lost balance, one foot dragging like a rookie tripping over his own authority. A chorus of gasps erupted from the crowd. Yo, she flipped him, did you see that? Got it on video too. Maddox's face turned crimson, his chest heaving like he'd just been tackled. He righted himself, barely, and stared at her with something beyond anger, now humiliation, raw and public. Nyla stood still, arms at her sides, calm, composed, unshaken. You just assaulted an officer, he spat. No, she said. I avoided unnecessary contact. It wasn't defiance, it was clarity. And now the story wasn't just between them, it was unfolding in front of a dozen lenses, in real time. A bystander called out, Arrest her for what? Walking while black? Maddox's hand hovered near his radio. Nyla's voice cut through before he could speak. If you escalate this, you'll regret it. And from the way he looked at her, he already did. The tension broke with the screech of another patrol car pulling up. Its engine hadn't even cooled before the door swung open and Sergeant Tom Rourke stepped out, all hard lines and quiet authority. He scanned the scene with a veteran's eye, the crowd, the phones, the red-faced officer, and the woman standing motionless in the center of it all. What's going on here? Rourke's voice carried not loud, but sharp enough to silence the murmurs. Maddox straightened like a schoolboy caught with his hand in the cookie jar. His breath was still heavy, his pride clearly bruised. She was non-compliant, aggressive, tried to... That's a lie, someone from the crowd interrupted. She barely moved, another chimed in. She just defended herself, he tried to cuff her for no reason. Rourke didn't respond. Not yet. His eyes were fixed on Nyla. She stood tall, not a bead of sweat on her brow, not a quiver in her stance. Just clarity. Strength. Ma'am, Rourke said, his tone noticeably more measured. May I ask your name? She reached into her pocket slowly, deliberately, and retrieved her ID again. This time, she held it out. Rourke took it gently, scanned it, then stopped. His eyes lifted. Captain Nyla Warren, he read aloud, and the moment he said it, everything shifted. Maddox froze. The crowd stirred again, this time with gasps and murmurs. You're military? Rourke asked, already knowing the answer. Yes, sir, Nyla replied, calm as ever. His expression darkened not toward her, but toward Maddox, who now looked like he wanted to disappear. You knew she was a SEAL? Rourke asked, turning to him. I thought it was fake, Maddox stammered, still clutching the ID like a burned man holding fire. Rourke didn't need more. The crowd didn't either. He turned back toward them. Does anyone have footage of the interaction? Nearly a dozen hands shot up. I got it from the beginning, said a young woman, raising her phone like a trophy. Rourke nodded grimly. Officer Maddox, he said, you're relieved of duty, effective immediately. The gasp from the crowd was almost physical. Maddox's face turned gray. You can't be serious. Don't make it worse, Rourke warned, the finality in his tone undeniable. Nyla didn't gloat, didn't smirk. She just stood there unmoved as the weight of truth came crashing down. The badge in Maddox's hands felt suddenly heavy, meaningless now, stripped of the power he'd tried to wield just minutes ago. He stood rigid, blinking hard, his mouth slightly open as if a defense might form itself from thin air. But nothing came. The crowd, once murmuring in shock, now watched in a stunned, reverent silence. And in the center of it all, Nyla Warren hadn't moved. She didn't need to. Sergeant Rourke turned to her, his tone shifting again, less official now, more personal. Captain Warren, do you wish to press charges? The question lingered in the warm air, heavy as a gavel. Maddox stiffened. The color drained from his face. Around them, the crowd leaned in, waiting, hoping, maybe even craving a taste of justice wrapped in retribution. Nyla looked at Maddox not with vengeance, not even with anger, but with something deeper, clarity. She saw him not as a man in uniform, but as one of many who doubted her, minimized her, tried to put her back in a place she never belonged. She inhaled, slow and even. No, she said at last. A ripple of surprise swept through the people gathered. Rourke's brow furrowed. You sure? I didn't come home looking for a fight, she replied. I just wanted to walk my street without being treated like a threat. Rourke nodded, slowly. He understood. Maybe more than he wanted to admit. Maddox didn't speak. Couldn't. His career, whatever was left of it, was already unraveling in the court of public opinion, right there on the sidewalk. Nyla turned then, steady and unshaken. The cameras followed her, but she didn't perform for them. She just walked past the patrol cars, past the stunned onlookers, past the spot where Maddox had tried to rewrite her story with a badge. There were no cheers, no parade, just footsteps, hers. As she passed the young woman still holding her phone, their eyes met. The girl didn't say anything. She just gave a small nod of respect, the kind passed from one witness to another. It wasn't about a legal win. It was about standing her ground, with dignity intact. Sometimes, Nyla thought, the real victory wasn't in forcing someone to pay. It was in making sure they could never forget. The sun had begun its slow descent by the time Nyla climbed the creaking back steps of her father's old house. The wood was warped in places, paint chipped from years of rain and silence. She didn't mind. It felt honest, worn, but standing. She sat, elbows resting on her knees, letting the warmth of the fading day seep into her bones. Her breath slowed. The weight of the afternoon hadn't left her body, but out here in the stillness, she could finally start to let it settle. The screen door creaked open behind her. "You always sit like that when you're thinking," came a familiar voice. She didn't have to turn. "Hey, Uncle Eli." He stepped out slowly, a bottle of iced tea in one hand, the other tucked into the pocket of his worn jeans. His hair had thinned and grayed since she'd last seen him, but his presence was the same solid, quiet, unshakable. He lowered himself onto the step beside her with a grunt. "You made the news, you know," he said after a moment. Nyla huffed a dry breath. "Wasn't planning on it." Eli handed her the tea. "Never are, but sometimes the news comes looking." They sat in silence for a while, the cicadas beginning their song in the trees beyond the fence. She took a sip, the cold hitting her throat like a reminder that she was here. Present. Not in Fallujah, not in Kandahar. Here. "You handled yourself well," Eli said, not looking at her. "Didn't let him take you out of who you are." She nodded slowly. "Did what I had to, just like your daddy." That made her pause. He looked at her now, really looked. "You know, he used to say the hardest battles weren't the ones with bullets. They were the ones where you had to fight for your place and still hold your peace." Her fingers tightened around the bottle. "I thought coming home would feel easier," she admitted. Eli nodded. "You came home changed, and the world here, well, it ain't caught up yet." She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Do you think it ever will?" Eli didn't answer right away. He leaned back, eyes on the orange-streaked sky. "That's not the question you should be asking." She turned to him. "The real question," he said, tapping the bottle against his knee, "is whether you're willing to be part of the change, even when it's slow, even when it's hard." Nyla didn't reply, but she didn't look away either. By morning, the footage had already made its rounds. It started on one girl's Instagram story, raw, unfiltered, shaky in the way truth always is. Then it spread, reposted, clipped, dissected, and shared. By noon, a hashtag was trending. #StandLikeNyla. At the Monroe Ridge precinct, Sergeant Rourke sat at his desk, the video playing silently on the small monitor before him. He didn't need the sound. He had heard enough in person. But watching it now from the crowd's angle, from the world's angle, he felt the weight of it differently. The image of Maddox lunging, the effortless precision of Nyla's movement, the steadiness in her voice, all of it was undeniable. And the worst part? Maddox hadn't just lost control, he had exposed something deeper, something systemic. A knock on the glass broke his focus. Officer Taryn Diaz, younger, sharp, stood holding a file. "Internal Affairs is requesting full statements, and..." She hesitated. "City Council's calling for a public review board." Rourke nodded. "Tell them they'll have it." She handed him the file, then paused. "Sir, do you think she planned to embarrass him?" He looked up. No, she planned to walk. Across town, at a local cafe, conversations buzzed louder than the espresso machine. A group of high school seniors huddled around a phone, replaying the clip for the 5th time. "She didn't even flinch," one of them said, wide-eyed. "She moved like she'd done that 100 times. She probably has." Not far away, Ms. Lorraine, a retired schoolteacher and longtime activist, drafted a petition on her tablet. "Community accountability," she muttered, tapping keys with precision. Time we stop acting like this is new. At home, Nyla stayed off social media. She didn't need to see herself go viral. Instead, she cleaned out the attic, dusted old boxes of her mother's things, reread a postcard from her first deployment. The ink faded, but the resolve still intact. The world outside was reacting, stirring, but inside she craved stillness. Not detachment, just clarity. What happened on that sidewalk wasn't some performance, it was survival. And now her act of restraint, of presence, of choosing not to vanish, had become something bigger. Not everyone would understand that, but someone somewhere might. And that, she thought, was more than enough to keep moving forward. The morning air was crisp, unusually cool for Monroe Ridge in early spring. The streets still glistened faintly from a late-night rain, and the neighborhood, though awake, moved slower than usual, like it was still processing something it couldn't name. Nyla stepped off the porch, hands in her jacket pockets, her boots tapping softly against the damp concrete. She wasn't headed anywhere in particular, no mission, no orders, just moving forward. The town looked different now, not physically. The buildings still leaned, the fences still sagged, the corner store still advertised 2-for-1 sodas. But something in the way people looked at her had shifted. Not fear, not awe, just recognition. At the edge of the block, a group of teens loitered outside the bodega again. One of them, the same boy who'd asked if she was military days before, spotted her. This time, he didn't ask anything. He just straightened his back, nodded once, and watched her pass with quiet respect. She nodded back. 2 blocks later, a little girl on a scooter zoomed by, her hair flying, laughter chasing her. As she passed Nyla, she looked up, then mimicked her posture, shoulders back, head high, like a soldier in formation. Nyla smiled, soft and fleeting. At a crosswalk, a woman waiting with her toddler caught her eye. "You're her, aren't you?" she asked. Not like a fan, but like someone asking if the storm they saw was real. Nyla gave a gentle nod. The woman didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. The look in her eyes said everything. By the time Nyla reached the basketball court near her childhood street, the sun had fully risen. Kids were running drills, trash talk flying with every bounce. Life had resumed. But something told her this time. It was watching itself more closely. She paused at the chain-link fence, watching the game. A familiar voice echoed in her head, her father's gruff, warm, "Pick your fights, but always finish the ones that matter." She took a breath, slow and deep, letting the morning fill her lungs. She hadn't changed the world, but maybe she'd changed something. Maybe that was enough. Turning from the court, Nyla kept walking, not as a soldier, not as a symbol, just as herself. And this time, no one stopped her. In a world where silence often protects power, Captain Nyla Warren reminds us that dignity, when held firm, can be more powerful than any uniform or badge. Her story is not just about resisting injustice, it's about doing so without losing yourself in the fight. For older generations who have weathered decades of change, her quiet strength echoes a familiar truth, that lasting change rarely comes in shouts or grand gestures, but in steady steps, courageous restraint, and the refusal to be diminished. We may no longer march in the streets or speak from podiums, but we can still teach, still witness, still hold the line. Nyla's story shows us that standing your ground with grace can ripple across a community. And sometimes the most profound resistance is simply choosing to walk forward, head high, heart steady, even when the world tells you to shrink. Because true power isn't in how loud you respond, it's in knowing who you are and not letting anyone take that away. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.